So good evening, everyone. We are thrilled to be in the company of such an incredible assembly of individuals tonight. If you haven't already, if I could remind you to silence your cell phones, we would appreciate that. I don't know if you've looked inside your book, but Mr. Hendrickson has signed all books. But if you do need something, an extra note, something special, he's going to come down to this table after the interview. So if you need to have that done, you're welcome to do that. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge the servicemen and women present with us this evening. Could you please stand so that we could recognize and express our gratitude for you, your dedication, your love for our nation. Thank you so much. Recognizing the significance of libraries and research in academic endeavors, the Library Board annually celebrates Joyce Butler, a local historian and author of the town's history book series. They do this by inviting a fourth grader to research and compose a 500-word essay about a distinguished individual, a historic edifice, or a significant occurrence in the town over the past 400 years. So following a very thorough review of all submissions, Claire Swan was declared the winner for her essay on Martin Pring. So Claire and her family are currently on vacation, so she's unable to accept her award here tonight, but she did receive a trophy in front of all of her classmates at Consolidated School on the last day of school. So congratulations, Claire. And we have some folks to thank before we get started. First, we'd like to welcome and thank our esteemed guests, Paul and Cecilia Hendrickson. Our sponsors, Spinnaker Trust, Lupin Booksellers, Alan and Norma Lamb, Mary and John Mills, Margie and Robert. Sorry, I almost called you Rob. Robert Dennis, Denise and Mike Iafola, Rosemary and Billy Shore, Mutasia, Kitchen Chicks Catering, Hurlbut Design, The Colony Hotel, Ann and Ken Rayner, Rich and Kristen Woodman, Edison Press, and Mike Kelly back there on the video. He spent the last 2 days here, so in the heat. So we really appreciate your help, Mike. Main and Vine, the Wine House on Main, and of course, the Kennebunk River Club and the staff. So thank you. And to our 2022 presenter, David Marinis and his wife Linda are here tonight. Thank you for being here. So, and this is a very special thanks to Denise Iafola for crossing all of the T's and dotting all of the I's. We could not have done this event without you, so thank you so much for all your help. A very special thanks to Sarah and Tom Vanderschaff for being great hosts to us and for introducing us to your lovely friends. And thank you all for purchasing tickets and supporting Graves Library. Your attendance at events like this enables us to continue providing vital services to our community. Your interest and donation ensures that 100% of the proceeds for this event go to the library. So on behalf of the Board of Trustees, the very hardworking staff, and all of the incredible volunteers, we extend our heartfelt thanks to you all. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce my friend, Billy Shore, the founder and executive chair of Share Our Strength, the parent organization of No Kid Hungry, and the No Kid Hungry campaign. He's going to share a few words about our esteemed guests here on the stage. So welcome, Billy.
Thank you, Mary Lou. Thank you so much, and thanks everybody for being here. Mary Lou, for the leadership that brings us all together on numerous occasions. We're so grateful. And to echo your thanks for Denise Iafola, who chairs the fundraising work at the library and has just done an amazing job. It's really special to have everybody here. I'm going to be brief tonight for three reasons. The first you might have noticed, it's warm. The second has to do with words that just ring in my ear from my son Nate, who some of you know now, he's 19, but when he was 5 years old, he had uncharacteristically misbehaved just in a minor way with his babysitter. And I think, Sarah, given your beautiful writing about parenting, you might appreciate this. He'd misbehaved a little bit, and Rosemary, my wife, called me at work, and she said, you need to leave work now, you need to come home, we need to talk to Nate about his character, the choices he makes, and his purpose on the planet. So Rosemary can be a little bit intense, but I did what I was told, of course, and came right home, and we talked to Nate, and we sat on the floor like in this little triangle, and he was incredibly polite, and Rosemary did most of the talking, after which she had the good sense to say to Nate, is there anything you would like to say to us? And he just looked at us dead in the eye, and he said, thank you for your little presentation. And so whenever I'm speaking, I think I don't want to get to the point where anybody has to say that. So I'll keep this brief. And then the third reason, of course, is we're in for such an incredible treat with Sarah and Paul in the conversation they're going to have about Paul's beautiful, beautiful new book, Fighting the Night. We have lots of kind of interlocking relationships here. Before I knew Sarah, I knew her dad, David Marinus, who as a political reporter was covering a campaign that I was working on back in a completely another lifetime for Senator Gary Hart. And Gary Hart was a big reader of books, articles, everything he could get his hands on. And every now and then he would say to me, he would hand me something to read and say, you have to read this. He writes like an angel. And I always thought, what does it mean to write like an angel? And then I started to read David, and I've read Sarah, and I've read Paul, and all three of them write like angels. And so to have them here is just, I think, an amazing, amazing experience. Just to say a quick word about each. Sarah is the latest blessing to be bestowed upon our little town of Kennebunkport. She settled here a couple years ago. She's a brilliant journalist. She's written for the Washington Post Health and Science pages. She writes about parenting, as I mentioned. She's got degrees from Northwestern and an MFA from University of Alabama. And one of the things that I know my wife Rosemary and I are most excited about is she's got a new play about Walt Whitman, which is absolutely stunning. And we're all going to be able to say we knew her when. So it's really, really an amazing accomplishment, Sarah. And Paul I came to know in a more curious way. He'd written a book called Looking for the Light, and I'm convinced that I owe the good fortune of my marriage to Paul, because when Rosemary and I were dating, I gave her this book. It had a really profound influence on me. It's about a photographer from the Farm Security Administration named Marion Post Walcott. Knopf published it, as they have published all of Paul's books. It's absolutely gorgeous, and as I say, it made just a great impression on me. And I gave it to Rosemary, and the book made a great impression on her, and it made a great impression on her that I was the one that gave it to her. I got great points for that, Paul. And so you should find the book. It's amazing. But one of the things that happened, and I looked back today, Paul, it was June 10th, 1992. The New York Times did a review of Looking for the Light. And I didn't know Paul at all. I had read the book. I didn't know a thing about him. And the review was, they had reviewed the book with another book, which annoyed me immediately, because to me that was kind of like diminishing the book, which I thought was a standalone book. And then they had lots of nice things to say about the book, but there was one kind of snide comment about the author intruding too much in the story. And so I was just outraged. I did something I've never done before. I called the Washington Post, because I knew from the book cover that Paul worked there. And I said, can you put me through to Paul Hendrickson? And they did, and Paul answered his phone. And I said, Paul, you don't know me, but I said, your book has had a huge influence on my life, and I just hope you'll ignore the New York Times review today. And Paul said, Billy, can you come over? He said, I'm really having a hard time with the review. Can you come over? And I said, come over. And this would be like Taylor Swift asking my 12-year-old granddaughter to come over. Like, come over? Yes. Are you kidding? So I went over to the Post. I think we had a cup of coffee. We ended up at Paul's house in Tacoma Park, spent the afternoon together, and just became really, really dear friends. And, it was surprising to me then. It's not surprising to me now, because Paul's writing and his body of work, from this book, Fighting the Night, all the way back to Looking for the Light and everything in between, is about an intimacy that you really don't find almost anywhere, and an intimacy that is not voyeuristic or exploitive, but is really authentic, and one that all of us can relate to in a way that I think Elia Kazan said, the more personal a story is, the more universal it is. And I find that in almost every word that Paul writes. So without anything more from me, I will take the advice of my son and say thank you for letting me make this little presentation, and I will turn the mic over to Sarah and Paul.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful.
Thank you. Great. Okay. Well, thank you. And can you hear me okay? I'm wearing a little lapel mic. Great. Well, references were made to my dad sitting in the front row, and I have to say that as my father, as he knew I would be doing the interview, he couldn't help but give me just a little bit of advice. And the first was to just let Paul say welcome first, because I know that we're just so happy to have you in Kennebunkport, and I know the building and the hospitality that the library has offered has welcomed him warmly, and I wanted to let you speak.
I was going to ask you if I could just acknowledge a few people. Welcome, welcome. Thank you so much for having my wife my wife and me to come to this beautiful event, this beautiful building. As soon as I walked in here a minute ago, I said, wow, a symphony of old wood. I hope they never change it. So as hot as it is, I'll take it. It's so beautiful. Yeah, I scribbled a couple notes on the veranda of the Colony Hotel a little while ago, just so that I could remember to thank all the right people, starting with Mary Lou and the library. Just bent over backwards in every detail to make, this is not my first rodeo in America of doing these kinds of things, and I must say the graciousness and hospitality that I am perceiving here from all of the folks involved with this event, I thank you very much. So Mary Lou, but all of the people at the library, whom I won't name, but I have met you, and thank you. And Sarah and Tom, we were at their home last evening for a beautiful, beautiful event in their beautiful home on Main Street, spelled M-A-I-N-E, I found out, in Kennebunkport. That was so beautiful. And my old comrade in arms, David Marinus, and his wife Linda, this very day, I'm going to embarrass David now, there's turmoil at the Washington Post. Some of you have been following that probably in the news. But David was described in social media somewhere today, I saw, as the legend of the Washington Post. And he truly is. He's written some beautiful, beautiful books. And we opened the promotion for the current book about a month and a half ago in Washington at our kind of home bookstore, David's and mine. It's called Politics and Prose, and David was sitting where Sarah is sitting. And I told the audience then, and I'll say it tonight, I've long ago stopped taking it personally that David and I are on a ratio of 2 to 1. He writes 2 books, I write 1. He has doubled me up. How he does that, I don't know. And that combined with this native Midwestern Madison, Wisconsin kind of decency and character, it all goes together. But I'm so happy to be here. Thank you, and I'll I slipped in a word about my wife. I'll just say none of this could happen without my wife Seal being here. So Sarah and I are totally unscripted. She said she might even ask me to read a little something. She said, "Do you want to see it?" I said, no, let's just go. Let's just go. So Sarah,
All
let's
right.
go. Anywhere
right.
you want to go.
Yeah.
I'm ready.
All right.
Except, in my stupid acknowledgments, I just forgot Billy Shore. Yes, he just introduced me, so I got to say something about Billy and Rosemary. His sister Debbie got up here from Washington, D.C. I have known Billy for all these decades, and he's been a wonderful supporter, and he and his sister founded this incredible organization, Share Our Strength, to help feed those who need feeding anyway. Thank you.
Yes. All right. All right, well, let's jump in. And I'm really excited everybody has a copy of the book now, and I'm not sure how many of you have read it already. I'm assuming most of you haven't, but a few have. So as I interview Paul, I'm sort of working on the assumption that you're going to read it in the days to come. Billy described something really, really well when he said that you pull us in an intimate way to your books. We feel that you're speaking to us, I think. And I also appreciated in the very beginning of this book, you, in a sense, establish an expectation of the reader that I think is extremely generous. And you say, this book is meant to be a reported memoir rather than a memoir per se. It's a kind of journalistic search for my father, although really for both my parents, and for some others too, who flowed in and out of their lives directly or indirectly. I nonetheless have a strong hope that if I set it down as conscientiously as I can, you who are reading it will also be able to hear some connecting chords to your own family's history. And I certainly did. When did you know it was time to write this book?
That's a beautiful place to start, Sarah. Thank you. I hope I can do this much justice with an answer. In the back of the book, in the acknowledgments and the notes, I start out by saying, for a book that has simmered on the back of my eyeball for at least half a century, there would be a lot of people to thank. It's true that I always wanted to write this book, and for combinations of reasons, I didn't try to write it. My father, who died at nearly 85 in 2003, I'm famously accused for taking tangents and detours. Here's one, parentheses. This book was published on May 7th. That was the formal publication date. That's the day my father died in 2003. So it was the 21st anniversary of his death when Fighting the Night was published. That in itself seems to me goosebumping and miraculous from a very personal point of view. And I know for a fact that the editorial team did not pick that date. The marketers did. They kind of hoped it would be a lead-in to Father's Day. They certainly didn't read the book, but they picked May 7th. And I looked at that date and I said, my goodness, that's the date my father died. Sarah, I long wanted to try to write this book, and maybe I was for years and years afraid. Seal has said, you've written about all these male figures, Hemingway and Frank Lloyd Wright. Why don't you try the real thing? Write about your father. It is a son's quest to try to understand his father. I mean, it's very much about World War II, and World War II is in the story in a great way, but in a way, I feel it's almost the backdrop. It's almost the stage setting, World War II. It's really about a son's search to know his difficult father. I loved my father deeply, and I think he loved me deeply, but it was in many ways a difficult relationship. He was up there in his wild blue yonder. The quote that you just referenced, Sarah, is powerful. And Billy was just referring to it. Billy said, that fundamental conundrum, contradiction, the more personal you write it, the more universal it can be. If I just went into a corner and started writing these details that did not resonate, that did not hit some kind of universal chord. So Sarah, I am honored and thrilled that that little passage would have connected with you, that I was trying to say, and that appears at the end of the prologue, and I was trying to say that if I have done this book even half right, I would hope that you who are out there reading it, and you who are out here sitting in this overheated, beautiful building, wooden building, would hear some connecting chords, some mystic chords of memory. That's stealing from Lincoln, isn't it? Mystic chords of memory in your own life. But you know, I want to get to your next question, and why am I making all this noise? I'm sorry. I was all set to have my jacket on tonight, and it was just too hot.
Yeah. Well, let's jump in then. Your father and the backdrop being World War II, I was struck by, in a sense, the prologue to that. Not literally the prologue, but the prologue of his life, or Act 1 of his life. This boy, he's the third of 9 children, born in Morganfield, Kentucky, during the Depression. And then he sets out in 1937 to join the Army Corps, Air Corps. And in a sense, through your research, but also probably through family lore, you knew of your father's childhood. But what did you discover about that man, the young man, before he set out to join the Army Air Corps in your research?
I'm loving the question, Sarah, and maybe I can speak more concisely. Yeah, my father grew up in the 1930s in Western Kentucky, a sharecropper's son, 9 children in the family, 8 boys, and the last being a baby girl. She's the last alive, my Aunt Margina, down there in Morganfield, about to hit her 90th birthday, 17 years younger than my father. That was the spread of those 9 sharecropping children. Born in Western Kentucky, there were, before rural electrification, no indoor plumbing. Why a third-born in a Depression family could have made this leap through time and space to not only become a World War II night fighter in the Western Pacific on Iwo Jima, but have a 30-year career in the airlines afterward is beyond me. That was something that I didn't hope to answer. It was just in him, because all my other uncles, and God bless them, and I love them all and knew them all, they basically stayed home, or if they didn't stay home, they had jobs that were not of the kind of job my father had, where he had this, what I feel is a leap through time and space. My dad, in the middle 30s, was sitting on wagon tongues in baking hayfields in Morganfield, Kentucky, watching crop dusters go over. And one day, a Ford Trimotor, you probably have heard of that gigantic plane, Ford Motor Company had something to do with it, flew over, and my dad said it shadowed the field, and it came very low. It was like a vision my dad was having. He was describing this to me toward the end of his life. He said, I almost thought a ladder was going to drop down, and I was going to be taken up. So he went into the house later that afternoon. He should have been out there working in the hayfield, but he was sitting on a wagon tongue looking at crop dusters and this big tri-motor. And he told my grandmother, he said, I'm going to grow up and fly airplanes. And she said, Joe Paul, because everybody had 2 names in Kentucky. She said, Joe Paul, if you want to commit suicide, why don't you just go out there and jump off the barn? So my father wasn't Lindbergh, but he made a leap through time and space. And there are hard stories in this book, and I don't want to minimize that. I was just alluding to a bit of a difficult relationship that we had. We tried to find ways all our lives to know each other, to talk to each other. But darn it, this is a book about an American hero. If the book does not come out a tribute in the end, it fails. I mean, if with its warts and all, if it does not come out a tribute, and not just to my father, but to my mother.
Actually, that's my next question. So thank you for the segue. I'm leaping a bit in the chronology of this story because you'll be reading it in days to come. One of the things that struck me, I'm getting feedback.
What are we doing, Mike?
Yeah.
We will get this right. Don't worry. Now you get to see Sarah's pretty dress all the way.
Okay, excellent. Thanks. Am I on? Yeah? Okay, awesome. So I'm jumping a bit. You know, your father meets your mother, and it's a wonderful story how they meet at a roller rink.
A roller rink.
Yeah, and they get married. And then 81 years ago, almost to this day, your father earned his wings. On June 22nd, 1943.
I didn't make that connection.
Yeah. So when they were newlyweds and then young parents, they moved a lot for his training. And you describe a perspective on your mother that I have to imagine you only gain now that you yourself are a father. And that was that she was pregnant and she was moving from place to place, having to find a baby doctor, you called it. And just that idea that, you know, when you're a younger person, you might not empathize or even think about what your parents were going through. When did that strike you, that your mother, too, had endured the stress of those transitions?
Thank you, Sarah. That's beautiful. And one more quick parenthesis. So I've done, by now, since May 7th when the book was published, probably 12.5 events, whether virtual, Zoom, radio interview, live stage event. I have noticed that when the women are the moderators, they ask the more interesting questions. My mother got married to my dad when she was 8 days 19. She was just 8 days past her 19th birthday. And when they said goodbye to each other on September 20th, 1944, in the dusty, scabby parking lot of a motor court in Amarillo, Texas, she was barely 21 and he is 25. They don't know if they will ever see each other again. She has 2 babies on her hip, one of whom is me, 6 months old. The other is my older brother, Marty, 16 months older than I am. He's now deceased. This book brought me into trying to imagine how hard that was. That's the family legend I grew up with, that they said goodbye in the Amarillo. The prologue is entitled Amarillo Goodbye. I knew that my whole life. But until I began trying to imagine myself, dream myself into that moment with this book, I had no idea, Sarah, how hard that must have been. So here's what happened that morning. About 9 o'clock in the morning on September 20th, 1944, it's in the photographs, the little dime store developed photographs are in the first page of my baby book. They're telling each other goodbye. And I can only think, with great tears. And my dad had his orders to go out to the local Army airfield in Amarillo and hop a government flight back to the West Coast and to rejoin his unit. My mother's job with another war wife was to drive eastward from Texas through all those states, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, whatever, Missouri, Indiana, into Ohio, where she had been born and raised, and where she was going to wait out the war with her 2 little babies. And there's a long paragraph in which I'm trying to imagine what that drive was like. 2 war wives had just said goodbye to their men, not knowing if they would ever see them again, and 2 little babies in the car. There were no such thing as seat belts. There were no such thing as disposable diapers. Baby poop is flying all over. You are observing the rationing of the gas and the wartime records, 35 miles an hour on 2-lane roads, and you're heating up the Gerber's baby food in hot pans in cheap motels every night. And meanwhile, choking down probably the terrible emotion, fear, grief. Will I ever see my husband again? So my mom got to Xenia, Ohio, where her mother and dad were, Nana and Pop. Pop was my surrogate father through the war. And I can only imagine my mother getting on her knees every night, begging that she wouldn't be a widow by the age of 21. And Sarah, until I began thinking about that moment. There's a whole other book to be written about my mom. This is a male-centric book. This book represents 4 generations. My dad, me, my 2 sons, and the 2 grandsons, my grandsons, to whom the book is dedicated. I'm sure a lot of you haven't read the book, but if you open it right up, it says to Jackson and Teddy Hendrickson. They're my 8 and 4-year-old grandsons. It's a male-centric book, but the female part of it, and asked by a wonderful questioner, is palpably, if a little obliquely, a very great part of this story.
I'm going to skip in time a little bit. When you see this picture, you see the plane, or a little bit of the plane that your father would ultimately fly. And you describe this plane as a new kind of war machine, a Northrop P-61 called the Black Widow. It was secret until January 8th, 1944. And so, a lot of us might have been to air museums or heard about the bombing planes of World War II, but this one is a little bit mysterious.
It's a beautiful question, and I'll be quick. This plane has a mystique to it, a P-61 Black Widow, a very distinctive looking plane with a twin boom aileron, came in very late in the war. My father volunteered to fly night fighters. I'm convinced that's one of the reasons he didn't die in the war, because he didn't get overseas until very late, because this plane came in very late. It was not a bomber, Sarah, and it was not a fighter. It was a combination of both. It was a pursuit ship, a P-61. It was armed to the oarlocks with armament. In the book, I call it a small, tight orchestra of violence. It had 50 caliber machine guns rotating in a turret right above. It was manned by the gunner, who sat immediately above my father. It's a 3-man ship. My father is in this little plexiglass with a canopy shield, which he used to call the greenhouse. Although when I say that, it sounds like he used to talk to me a lot about the war. He did not, but whenever it came up, I remember him once calling it the greenhouse. And then in the back was the radar guy. So this ship was with state-of-the-art radar sealed in its nose, and it flew in Europe, it flew in the European theater, and it flew very much in the Pacific theater. I've often thought about that, Sarah. You asked so beautifully about the feminine side of this book, the female side. I grew up with the legend of the Black Widow. By the way, there's only one of the reasons it's so legendary. There's 4 known to be in existence. At the end of the war, they were expendable metal. They got shoved off of mountaintops. They got shoved off of aircraft carriers. My dad's might have been ground up as part of new runway fill at Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines. I've sort of been able to track. The name of my dad's plane was the Rita B, because that was the young girl he met at the Xenia, Ohio roller rink, Rita Bernadine. And so he had painted on the glossy black nose in curvy white, the Rita B. So the Rita B right now may be as part of the runway fill at Clark Air Base in the Philippines. There's only 4 in existence. One is at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, right near where my parents met. One is at the Dulles Air and Space Museum, the Dulles Annex, not the museum on the mall. One is in Beijing, China, at the Air and Space, and the other is being restored in Reading, Pennsylvania, at a little mom-and-pop air museum. It's only an hour from Philadelphia, where we live. And the dream, they've been trying to restore this plane for 15 years. The dream is to crank her up, push her out of the shed, fly her out over the cornfields, a vision, a Black Widow. This was a pretty remarkable airplane. One quick last thing. You know, if you're flying this plane over land in the pitch of night, you might see a bead of light down there that'll help you with your reckoning. But these guys were flying this plane in the pitch of the Western Pacific. I mean, total blackness. My dad, at his death, at nearly 85, still had 20/20 vision. He had superior nighttime vision. You couldn't begin to qualify for the night iron, as I remember him calling it once, unless you had exceptional vision. But yeah, the legend of the P-61 is, and I bet some of you have heard of the Black Widow because it was so black and glossy. Some of the pilots had a red hourglass painted on the belly, like the Black Widow spider, from which she took her mythic name.
Yes. All right, we're going to jump to October 12th, 1944. You said your father entered the war late, which may have been something that contributed to his surviving. And you talk about the journey he took. And again, this boy from Western Kentucky, now he's beginning a journey that you calculated to be 8,000 miles, going from California and then to Hawaii. And then I have to just say there's a little bit of humor when he leaves Hawaii. Can you describe, I don't know when your father told you the story of all the Black Widows leaving Hawaii to make their way towards Iwo Jima, but
they loaded their planes down with beer so that they barely make weight to get off the ground. Cases of beer. Yeah, it was a 3-man airplane. And everything about it was slimmed down. But he did tell me once that when they lifted off, they trained in Hawaii, got their planes in Hawaii, and then they got their orders. The rumor was they were going to Iwo Jima. He landed with his squadron on Iwo Jima 3 weeks after the Marines had raised the flag on Mount Suribachi, and every one of you in this building can squint and see that photograph on the back of your eyeball. They made a kind of a lazy U loop through the Pacific to these various islands that the Americans had taken back from the Japanese. They got to Saipan, and they held for a month on Saipan doing nightly patrol duty, which was scary, but Saipan was fully in our possession, so it wasn't that scary. And then the Marines have secured the island, supposedly, but not really, and that's another part of the book, and maybe we'll talk about it, and maybe we won't. But it was 3 weeks later that he landed with his in a convoy of 15 widows, the Rita B being one, in the 549th NFS, Night Fighter Squadron. It was a 300-man squadron, and 50 of them were officers, pilots, and radar officers, and the others were enlisted men.
Well, I think one of the points of the book, as you describe your father's bravery, it's also psychological bravery. It's not just that he was in situations in which his mettle was tested, but that he was entering them in which he already knew that there was danger. And one of those, of course, is how you describe circling Iwo Jima, knowing what has just taken place, and seeing, in a sense, the wreckage of the ships and so forth. Can you describe, just so we understand, in a sense, what your father would have been, his orders were to go, and he did, but what would he be seeing as he landed or as he approached Iwo Jima?
Only 5 or 6 times in my dad's life, and I knew him for 59 years, nearly 60 years. Only this many times did he ever talk about the war. I think that's a pattern. I've talked to many, many people who say, well, my dad didn't talk about it either. They didn't want to talk about it. Why didn't I pull him out more on it? I'm haunted by all I don't know about my father. I am, and about the war. I'm haunted in general about all I don't know about my father, but I have consuming regret about wanting to know more, even though I got his entire service file, which is a whole other story. But Sarah, again, you are asking questions that have not been asked of me. How did you do this so well? So none of those guys talked about it very much. I think part of my father's disinclination to talk about it, he knew what had happened on the ground in those days and weeks before he got there. And it was as if to say, well, my contribution, what I did is negligible. He said, I heard him say a few times in his life, well, I didn't really do that much in the war, Paul. And his mission reports contradict that. But he would say, I didn't do that very much in the war, Paul. And I said, but you were there, Dad. And his answer was, yes, I suppose that is so. But Sarah, I think circling Iwo Jima for the first time, about to make the first landing at Southfield on Iwo Jima, right in the shadow of Mount Suribachi, and seeing in the surf the listing ships that were in wreckage, and the bodies had been cleared away. Do you know the Battle of Iwo Jima is one of the costliest and deadliest and dirtiest and bloodiest sieges in all of World War II? It's the greatest loss the Marines suffered at a single place. It's the only battle of World War II where the American casualties were greater than the Japanese casualties. Casualties meaning killed and wounded. There were actually more Japanese killed, but the total number of casualties, the American side exceeded. And what was in my dad's mind is circling in the Rita B, about to make his landing for the first time, looking down and seeing those bloody sands of Iwo Jima. And it would have been what, another decade before, or decade and a half before John Wayne makes the sands of Iwo Jima. And I don't think that John Wayne's version of what went on in Iwo Jima was anything remotely like what really happened on Iwo Jima. I think those Marines who were dying, and I wonder if any of you, a New Englander, know the name William Manchester. He wrote a book about his Marine experience in the Pacific. It's called Goodbye, Darkness. I couldn't carry the water of that book, and Iwo Jima is a little in that book. He was in other battles, but he describes what happened on Iwo Jima. I mean, we don't need to get ghastly here, especially on an overheated day, but your imaginations can, heads found 15 yards from their torsos. And so my father's circling, and I'm wondering what is going through his head.
And then six days after he arrives, you say, the way I've come to view this story and you can decide if you want to tell the story or not, is that the literal and spiritual distance between the possibility of my father getting killed, but instead being allowed to live 6 nights after he had come to Iwo was about 30 yards.
Well,
the awful randomness of chance.
I'll tell it. Let me try to tell it economically. Sarah, this is the only overlapping question with your dad on May 6th at Politics and Prose. So the island is supposedly secure. The Marines have paid this terrible price. And here come the flyboys now. Here comes the 549th Night Fighter Squadron in their Black Widows. 6 nights after he's on the island, and they're sleeping in tents. He's sleeping in an 8-man officer's tent, and they're lined up in 2 rows on this side. And 30 yards away, across a little stretch of sand, are the rows of the enlisted men, 250 enlisted men. It's a 300-man squadron. In the middle of the night, an uncounted number of Japanese came out of the caves and bunkers. There may have been as many as 600. And they came on a suicide attack. It wasn't, the word we kind of know in the West is banzai, which is just an all-out suicide attack. This was a strategically thought-out attack called a Kirakomi. And what they wanted to do was get the flyers, because the flyers were going to do the damage. And my father's bivouac, my father's encampment, my father's row of tents, because there were other squadrons pitched right over here, and Navy CB units and other groups. My father's squadron was right in the red hot center of it. It started at 4 a.m. and the Japanese came screaming through, slicing open the tents with their sabers and rolling in grenades. For some reason, and no one will ever know, they concentrated. They wanted to get the flyers, but they went toward the enlisted tents more. My father's tent did get sliced open, and he rolls off his cot, and he's got his .45 sidearm like this, trembling, holding it out, expecting any second a maniacal face to appear. But 6 men from his squadron died, and they were 30 yards away on the enlisted men's side. For some reason, when they came screaming through, they didn't come to the officer's side, they came to the enlisted side. It was a 4-hour attack before the Marines came in with their flamethrowers and satchel charges. And just as Sarah beautifully quoted, I've thought about that so much. And I say that it seems to me, from the vantage point of all these years, that the fact that my father was allowed to live 6 nights after he's on Iwo Jima, and this is happening on the ground, not up in the air. He had some scary stuff happening up in the air, but this is 6 nights later down on the ground. The distance, the emotional, psychological, literal, and factual distance between him being allowed to live 6 nights after he's on Iwo Jima was about 30 yards. And I said that, to me, is somehow the awful randomness of chance.
And that randomness, I want to loop in another story that I think might resonate, especially for our audience here. Your father was on Iwo Jima, but he had a mission to Chichijima, another island. And 7 months before your father got near that island, something, you say, barbaric had happened on it. Had fate tilted in another direction, it might have happened to him, your father. In September of 1944, the planes of at least 11 Navy flyers got shot down in the waters off Chichijima. 9 aviators survived, and 8 were captured and tortured. And I'm going to let you read the next section.
Thank you. Sarah told me she was going to ask me to read something. She said, "Is that all right with you?" And I said, yes, but I immediately remembered something. I went to a reading once, I'm in a book event once, in Washington with the famous, esteemed Gore Vidal. And Gore Vidal said, any author who ever reads from his own book at a book reading is a horse's ass.
Sorry.
Would you pardon the horse's ass here? I know this will resonate with Kenny Bunkport. And after I read this, I even have a little addenda PS. But here it is. This is from the book. My father was sent on a mission to Chichijima, which is 150 miles north of Iwo Jima, and his mission was to go up there and strafe and bomb. And this one night, he nearly lost his life. But this is about something, because he got trapped in the searchlights, this is about something that happened 7 months before. Of the 11 aviators whose planes were shot down, and of the 8 aviators who were captured and tortured, and of the 4 whose remains got eaten, only one escaped this hell. Although in a deeper sense, he escaped nothing. He was 20. He was a lieutenant, junior grade. He came from a pedigree East Coast family. He was already mildly famed for having become one of the youngest pilots to serve in the Navy. In 1944, flying against Chichijima, he commanded a 3-man Grumman TBF Avenger, a torpedo bomber able to take off from and land on aircraft carriers. When his Avenger got hit and caught fire, the lieutenant bailed out, his parachute opening cleanly. One of his crew got stuck inside the plane and crashed with her into the sea. The chute of his other crewman never opened. But the lieutenant, as if divinely protected because he had another destiny awaiting him, bobbed in the choppy waters off the island until sailors on a suddenly surfaced Navy sub roped him to safety. His name was George H.W. Bush. This afternoon, about 4 hours ago, my wife and I are driving around. We're loving Kenny Bunkport. I said, let's go see the golf course. We park our car, and I'm a little slow on the uptake, and we're walking through the parking lot, and I'm seeing these glossy, big black limos. And Seal said, and we were looking at each other. I said, somebody's here. I thought, we walked within 2 feet of George H.W. Bush's son. W was teeing off this afternoon out at the golf course. So my wife would have nudged me, go up and talk to him and tell him you wrote his father into the book. But I didn't do that. No. So,
yeah. I want to ask you about something about your style of writing, which those who've read his other books might notice, which is that you use photographs in a way almost cinematically to stop time, move us before the photo was taken, move us after it, and play with that in-between time. And you quote the poet Mark Strand in his essay on the sadness of a family portrait. Like childhood itself, it, meaning the portrait, is innocent of the future.
That's such a beautiful quote. And Sarah, I know I sound like I'm sucking up to you, but I love your questions. Yeah, this is a second kind of overlapping question with your dad too. Yeah, I do use photographs. I like to dream myself into the rectangle. I started a course at the University of Pennsylvania. David and I started at the Washington Post in the same year. I stayed 23 years. David stayed the whole way. I went to the University of Pennsylvania to Philadelphia. I have just retired from teaching at Penn, but for 26 years I was on the faculty. I started a course called Telling Stories Out of Photographs, The Hungry Eye. And you get the students to dream themselves into that photograph. There is an ocean of story trapped in those 4 rectangle walls. If you can go into it enough, if you can almost literally step into it, dream yourself in, but using every fact you can find, and use memory by which you extract memory from those who you ask about the photograph, use your imagination. That beautiful quote by the poet Mark Strand, I do quote that. And that, it seems to me, Sarah, germane to a lot of what we're talking about, this notion of, I have to say this, Sarah, like childhood itself, it is innocent of the future. I am describing the moment of that photograph in Amarillo, Texas, when my parents told each other goodbye. My mom, as I said, barely 21, my dad 25. The night before in that motel room, I mean, surely they sobbed themselves to sleep and made love, and after they got the two of us to bed. I'm trying to imagine all of that, but that quote, like childhood itself, it is innocent of the future. And the future is, like every family, and I'm not being presumptuous about your families, I'm talking about mine, but I know I've lived on the earth long enough to know about the sorrows that thread themselves through, along with the joys, along with the glories of so many families in America. Like childhood itself, it is innocent of the future. I did not have any, I could not have had any awareness, that little 6-month-old child, freeze-framed in that moment of eternity, in that Amarillo scabby parking lot of future heartache in our family. And that's what this book was trying to do. This book is trying to describe what I feel genuinely is the best years of their lives. And that's like the old movie. And we talk about the greatest generation. Yes, they were that, unquestionably. You know, Sarah, one of the things I've asked myself, could I have remotely done what my parents did? So I'll put myself in my father's shoes because I'm a male, my dad. He did this at 25. He went 8,000 miles out into the Pacific, 8,000 miles from California, into the Pacific. And could I have? And I'm thinking the answer is no. I could not have done. These people, I'm thinking if not your mothers and fathers, in some cases your grandparents who were the World War II generation. But I see enough older faces in here that I think some of your parents did this same thing. What did they do? Billy Shore told me his dad was an Army guy for 4 years and didn't talk about it. And he's got a big envelope that he didn't open for 10 years. Why didn't he do that? That's a mysterious question that I totally got and didn't get in a way. These people did something truly heroic. Could our country summon this kind of moment, this kind of valor, this kind of unanimity again? I have no idea, but when I'm thinking no, actually, but when I think of my own parents, of what they did, that's a true moment of bravery. They knew they were participating in something way above them. This thing was thrust on them. They didn't want it. Sarah referenced the back and forth across the country. My parents were going, they got married in Xenia, and for the next 14 months, they were in 23 towns in America. Air base to different station, different state, back and forth. And sometimes they drove, and sometimes Pullman car train, and doing this thing, and then babies come along, and then saying goodbye to each other. So this book is trying to be a tribute to all that without stinting on the sad stuff. David and I will resonate. At the Washington Post, we used to say, in for a dime, in for a dollar. If you're going to go there, you've got to go there. But I want the hard things to be the minor key And the major key is this opening quote that you quoted here at the beginning so resonantly and beautifully, that if I've done it conscientiously, if I've done it sensitively, or even half sensitively, then it will register perhaps a chord, however faint, in your own family's history. That's all I want.
You are a storyteller, and as I read your book, I had to wonder how much of that quality came from your father. You describe him as a storyteller, but you also said that my talkative father tended to speak in laconic ways about tragic events, in or out of the air. When did you notice that about your father, and when did you put the pieces together to understand what that meant about him and about the event itself?
My parents were high school education. That's as far, I mean, how does a sharecropper's son go to college? And the only reason he was able to qualify for flight school was because he had all these years as an enlisted man from 1937 forward. And then the war comes along, and they greatly need pilots, and he had had all his ground experience as a mechanic. My dad, with his high school education, spoke continuously in metaphor without even, for his whole life, knowing what a metaphor is. He spoke so colorfully. It's that Western oral tradition, that Southern tradition, that Kentucky tradition. I quote a little funny line in the book. If he were in a movie theater and we started smelling smoke, he might turn and say, "We better get out of here before the fire starts licking at our boots." He would never say, "Gee, he spoke so colorfully," and I think I imbibed that half consciously. But again, Sarah, your question, my talkative farm boy daddy could grow incredibly laconic in moments of true grief. His best man at his wedding got shot down flying a transport plane over what they called the hump, the Himalayan mountains in the Indo-Western China border war. And my father used to say, you'll excuse, my father didn't say Japanese, he said the Japs. He said, Japs got him flying over the hump. That's all he would say. Japs got him flying. He could just go, and he was a pilot, he was a captain on Eastern Airlines, and when something tragic happened, a fellow flyer, a fellow captain on Eastern Airlines who was his friend, took it right into the concrete at Idlewild, what was then called Idlewild, in New York, JFK now, and killing everyone on board, including the whole crew, including my dad's friend, the captain. And my dad explained that to me by simply saying, wind shear got him, Paul. That's all he said. Wind shear got him, Paul. My father was a very complicated man. He made his living with he was a blue-collar guy who was in a white-collar job. He was doing something mechanical with his hands, flying these major jets out of Chicago down to Puerto Rico and turning around and coming back the same day. But in another sense, he was that farm boy who knew the inside of a plane inside and out. He could get his feelings very hurt. He was a sensitive guy, and yet we had such different occupations. He took me to a night fighters convention. He was not a reunion guy. He was not a convention guy, but he knew that I wanted to write this book. This was way back in 1982. I was a Washington Post guy. And he was introducing me to Pinky and Geronimo and Lit and all his, this is 4 decades after the war, and he would say, "This is my son Paul, he works for the Washington Post, don't tell him a damn thing. He'll use it on me, Washington, don't tell him." But he was secretly hoping and wanting, I think, this book to be written. And of course, I know your next question, would he be satisfied with what I wrote? Boy, I don't have the answer to that. I think I got about that much of it right.
Well, it is interesting. You said that there are no surviving letters between your mother and father. And I thought you were very generous when you speculated that that was because they moved so often.
Yeah.
'Cause
My
I know,
my
yeah.
mother wrote to my dad every day. Where are those letters? We don't have them. I said 35 minutes ago that I'm haunted by all I don't know. I'm consumed with regret about all that I didn't ask. My mother told me that she wrote to my father every day for the 5.5 months that he was on Iwo Jima, and he would write back to her maybe 2 or 3 times a week. And I imagine that the letters would arrive in batches, in batches of 5 or 6. She's got a letter every day to him. We have none of those letters. This book has some beautiful photographs in it. We have the photographs. My 2 surviving siblings and I have the photographs. We don't have the letters. Where are those letters? I can picture my mother reading a letter from my father before she turns out the light. She has put Marty and me to bed. I'm 6 months, he's 21 months. She's put us to bed. She reads the latest letter. She puts it in a box. I'm imagining all this, I don't know. She puts it in a box, she slides the box under the bed, she turns out the light and she goes to bed. And where the ones he read on Iwo Jima by dim wattage in his tent, where are those letters? They're gone, we don't have them.
Well, I'm going to end with one more quote and let you riff on it a bit. You quote, and also I just have to say that your professorial bona fides come through, because when I read your book, I want to take notes and create a syllabus of all the poems and the writers that you quote and weave into the story. And this one is from Doris Lessing, and you quote them saying, "We use our parents like recurring dreams, to be entered into when needed. They are always there for love or for hate. But it occurs to me that I was not always there for my father." And you add on to that to say that you too might not have always been there for your father.
I have to say, Sarah, well, actually, I tried out parts of this book in little shadows and feints through these 5 years of there's a online publication. It's pretty well regarded. It's called Literary Hub, Lit Hub. Maybe some of you know it. And I wrote a part of the book and published it there. And David said to me, he said, I knew I wanted to read your book when I read that Doris Lessing quote. It's such a beautiful quote. I bet they'd love to hear it again, because I think it might resonate with this audience.
Do you want me to read it again?
Yeah.
Okay. "We use our parents like recurring dreams, to be entered into when needed. They are always there, for love or for hate. But it occurs to me that I was not always there for my father."
So Doris Lessing, a great writer from Zimbabwe, said that she was writing about her father. Sons writing about their fathers is a great body of literature. Daughters writing about their fathers, that body of literature exists too. Doris Lessing writes that beautiful line in a memoir of her father. But I tagged on to Doris Lessing's quote, just as Sarah referenced, that it occurs to me now, in my old age, that perhaps I wasn't always there for my father. Meaning this, I wonder whether he would have welcomed me. It seemed to me he didn't want me to ask about it. And he certainly didn't bring it up on his own. But I'll never know. But it seems to me, it does occur to me that there were times when I was not always there for my father.
Thank you. That.
You know what I would like to say? Sarah, must have so prepared for this. She's got pages and pages and pages. And because I talk so, she didn't get even half of it. Bless her, bless her, bless her. But the 10 or 12 that she did ask, they're the right ones, weren't they?
I was going to end with, Paul beat me to it, but I have a list of metaphors his father uses that he quotes. I was going to do a speed round. So I had we'd better get out of here before a fire starts licking our boots. That one. Here's another one that I like that you can just end with. Well, son, I suppose we better be off like a herd of turtles before we lose our nerve.
I used to fly with my dad in all the after years, long after he was retired from the airlines. Here is a fact. My father died at 84 and a half. He was still flying a little single-engine plane deep into his 70s, and I was unafraid to go up with him to wonder at his skills, and he had his skills. He could land at a little grass field in Ontario at a fishing lodge, a grass strip, and give the damn strip back some change. I mean, he could come in and need his, and here's something I saw my father do. I was in the seminary. I studied to be a priest as a young man. That's a whole other angle and part of the story. Never mind, never mind. But one seminary summer, I'm in the body of the plane of an Eastern Airlines jet, and my father is shooting the river approach at National Airport. It wasn't Reagan National, it was National Airport. I bet some of you have landed at National Airport, and there are two ways to land. You come in through Virginia, or you knife right down the Potomac. And I'm sitting in the body of that plane, and my father is arcing and smoothing and captaining her onto those tight runways. You got to come inside the Lincoln Memorial, and you got to shave yourself inside the Washington Monument, and then you got to hook. You got to smooth it right onto those tight runways at National. I wonder how many times the political reporter David Marinus has been in the body of a plane as some captain is doing. But my father was doing this at this moment, and it seemed to me that he was a man working with a hand trowel. And I wanted to turn. I was 16. I wanted to turn to the person next to me and say, my father just did that. I didn't literally do it, but I spiritually did it.
That's pretty cool. Yeah. All right.
We're good to go. You're good to go. Thank you for putting up with this.
Yeah. Oh, you're going to sign books.
You were so good. You were so good. Look at that list of.
I got through.